The morning air carried the brittle silence of early winter as a county maintenance worker noticed disturbed frost near a cottonwood stand off Old River Road, where tire impressions broke the frozen ground and something pale lay unnaturally still, drawing investigators into a discovery that would haunt Montana law enforcement for decades. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. By the time sheriff's deputies arrived, the sun had barely lifted above the Yellowstone River Valley. December of 1992 had settled into south-central Montana with its familiar gray restraint. Not yet the brutal cold of January, but sharp enough to preserve details no one wished to see. The location sat just beyond the edge of town, where asphalt gave way to gravel and ranch fencing marked long property lines. What lay near the trees was not immediately identifiable from a distance, only that it did not belong there. The responding officers documented the scene carefully, aware from the first minutes that the placement suggested intention rather than accident. The victim was soon identified as 22-year-old Emily R. Calder, a local woman who had grown up in the area and recently returned after a short attempt at college out of state. Emily worked part-time at a bakery near Main Street, saving money while deciding her next steps. She was described in police records as reliable, routine-driven, and close with her family. Her disappearance had been reported 2 days earlier, on the evening after Christmas Eve, when she failed to return home following a late shift. The initial scene processing reflected the investigative standards of the early 1990s. Photographs were taken with film cameras, measurements logged by hand, and evidence carefully bagged against the cold. There were no signs of a struggle in the immediate area, no scattered personal effects, and no obvious witnesses. Tire impressions were visible but incomplete, distorted by overnight frost. The body position and environmental exposure suggested she had been placed there rather than arriving on her own. Investigators noted this in their first reports, cautious not to overinterpret before autopsy results. Emily's family home sat less than 3 miles away. Missing person flyers had already gone up in grocery stores, gas stations, and the post office. Her parents had expected holiday distractions to delay initial concern, but when Christmas Day passed without contact, they contacted authorities. In a town where people noticed unfamiliar cars and routines mattered, her absence had been quietly alarming even before confirmation arrived. The autopsy, conducted at the State Crime Lab in Helena, reflected both the limits and strengths of forensic science at the time. The medical examiner documented indicators consistent with homicide, ruling out environmental causes and accidental death. There was no need for graphic detail to establish the conclusion. Time of death was estimated within a narrow window on Christmas Eve night. Trace evidence was collected and preserved, though the lab lacked the ability to fully analyze genetic material beyond blood typing and basic serology. Investigators began the methodical process of reconstructing Emily's final movements. She had clocked out shortly after 9:00 p.m., waved to a coworker, and stepped into the cold parking lot behind the bakery. Her car was later found parked legally outside her family's home, indicating she had likely returned to town before something interrupted her routine. There were no signs of forced entry in the vehicle, no obvious damage, and nothing missing of value. Witness interviews followed a familiar pattern. Coworkers reported nothing unusual. A customer remembered seeing Emily that evening, tired but calm. Neighbors near the Calder home recalled no disturbance, no late-night noise, no unfamiliar vehicles. One resident mentioned a pickup truck idling briefly near the intersection around 10:30 p.m., but the description was vague and inconsistent with other accounts. Local media coverage remained restrained at first, reflecting both respect for the family and uncertainty within the investigation. The weekly paper printed a short article on page 3, noting the discovery and asking anyone with information to contact the sheriff's office. Radio stations mentioned the case during morning updates, their tones somber and cautious. In coffee shops and hardware stores, conversations lowered when the subject came up. As December turned toward New Year's, detectives expanded their focus beyond immediate surroundings. They reviewed known offenders in the county, examined recent parole releases, and requested assistance from the Montana Department of Justice. None of the early leads produced actionable results. The tire impressions could not be conclusively matched. Fibers collected at the scene yielded no comparison samples. Without eyewitnesses or a clear suspect, the case entered a familiar but unwelcome phase. The investigation did not stop, but it slowed. By February, winter had erased remaining physical traces from the scene. Files grew thicker with interview summaries, timelines, and lab reports, but thinner in momentum. Detectives rotated to other cases, while one investigator retained primary responsibility for periodic review. Emily Calder's name joined a quiet list maintained in filing cabinets rather than headlines. Her family marked time differently. Birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays accumulated weight. Each Thanksgiving and Christmas brought renewed attention from local papers, often accompanied by updated appeals for information. The sheriff's office reissued composite timelines and emphasized that no detail was too small. Tips arrived sporadically, often well-meaning but unverifiable, sometimes based on rumors rather than observation. By the late 1990s, advances in forensic science began to outpace the capabilities available when the case began. DNA analysis moved from novelty to standard practice. Cold case units emerged within state agencies, tasked with revisiting unsolved homicides using new tools. Emily's case was flagged for potential review, but resource limitations delayed comprehensive re-examination. It was not until 2008 that the case file was formally reopened under a renewed cold case initiative. Boxes were retrieved from storage, evidence re-inventoried, and chain of custody logs audited. The preserved biological material, once inconclusive, was now suitable for modern testing. Analysts worked cautiously, aware that degradation and contamination posed risks after so many years. A partial genetic profile was developed and entered into national databases. Initially, it returned no matches. Investigators adjusted expectations, understanding that database coverage was incomplete and dependent on prior offender submissions. Still, the profile remained, waiting silently as technology and participation expanded. Meanwhile, detectives revisited witness statements with fresh eyes. Minor inconsistencies once dismissed gained new relevance when placed against broader patterns. The mention of the idling pickup truck resurfaced, this time cross-referenced with vehicle registrations from the early 1990s. One name appeared repeatedly in peripheral contexts, never as a suspect, always just outside formal suspicion. That individual, now living out of state, had worked seasonal construction near the river in 1992 and owned a pickup matching the general description. He had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation and cleared due to lack of evidence. At the time, there was nothing to hold him. Now, his background warranted renewed attention. Investigators proceeded cautiously, adhering strictly to legal standards. They requested additional records, employment logs, and historical addresses. Surveillance was not possible retroactively, but patterns emerged through documentation. When the suspect was eventually asked to provide a voluntary DNA sample, he declined. That refusal was noted, not as evidence, but as part of a growing picture. The breakthrough came quietly in 2021, when a familial DNA search produced a potential relative match. Genealogical research narrowed the possibilities, aligning with the previously noted individual. A court order was obtained, supported by affidavit and reviewed by a judge. The subsequent sample confirmed the match. In the spring of 2022, nearly 30 years after Emily Calder's death, an arrest was made. The announcement was brief, factual, and devoid of celebration. The suspect was extradited to Montana, charged and held pending trial. The community reacted with a subdued mixture of relief and reflection. The legal process unfolded without spectacle. Evidence was presented methodically. The defense challenged timelines and degradation, while prosecutors relied on corroboration rather than drama. Ultimately, a plea agreement was reached, acknowledging responsibility and sparing the family a trial. Sentencing took place in a quiet courtroom. Emily's name was spoken aloud again, formally, with care. The sentence reflected both the gravity of the crime and the passage of time. Outside, snow fell lightly, much as it had in 1992. Afterward, the town returned to its routines. Files were archived with final notation. The bakery changed owners. New flyers covered old bulletin boards. For Emily's family, closure did not mean forgetting, only that uncertainty had ended. The case was solved, not loudly, but correctly, leaving behind a record of patience, persistence, and the slow reach of justice. The arrest did not end the need to understand how nearly 3 decades had passed between discovery and resolution. For investigators, the work continued backward, reconstructing every decision made since December 1992. The cold case review demanded accountability as much as answers, requiring a clear explanation of what had been known, what had been missed, and what had simply not been possible at the time. In the early months after Emily Calder's death, the sheriff's office had operated with a small staff stretched across a large geographic area. Rural Montana policing relied heavily on familiarity rather than specialization. Detectives handled burglaries, assaults, and homicides simultaneously, often without dedicated forensic support. The Calder case file showed diligence, but also the constraints of the era. Leads were followed until they ended, then set aside in favor of active cases with solvable timelines. The bakery parking lot where Emily was last seen received renewed attention during the cold case review. Original photographs were digitized and enhanced. Investigators examined lighting placement, sightlines, and traffic patterns from Christmas Eve 1992. Holiday business hours had extended later than usual, and several nearby stores had closed early due to weather forecasts. The parking lot was darker than it would have been on an ordinary weekday, a factor noted but never emphasized in original reports. Reviewers noted that Emily's routine had made her predictable. She worked consistent shifts, took the same routes, and returned home promptly. That predictability, combined with holiday distractions, created a narrow window of vulnerability. No evidence suggested she had deviated voluntarily from her routine. Bank records showed no unusual withdrawals. Phone records, limited to landlines, showed no late-night calls. Investigators also revisited the vehicle evidence. Emily's car had been processed quickly in 1992, cleared of obvious fingerprints beyond her own and family members. At the time, latent prints required manual comparison against limited databases. During the cold case review, preserved lift cards were re-examined, but no new identifications emerged. Still, the absence of forced entry or struggle inside the vehicle reinforced the theory that Emily either knew her assailant or was approached under non-threatening circumstances. Witness statements from neighbors were scrutinized again, this time with greater emphasis on timing. One neighbor's recollection of a pickup truck idling near the intersection gained significance when aligned with weather data. Records showed that temperatures dropped sharply around 10:00 p.m., making idling more likely for someone waiting rather than passing through. This detail, once dismissed as incidental, became a contextual anchor. The suspect's original interview transcript was located in a separate administrative file, nearly overlooked due to clerical changes over the years. In 1992, he had been cooperative, providing an alibi that placed him alone at a rental property he claimed to be repairing. No one corroborated his account, but absence of contradiction was considered sufficient at the time. Cold case investigators noted the lack of verification, but acknowledged that standards then differed from current practice. As the review expanded, investigators canvassed retired officers who had worked the case. Memory had faded, but impressions remained. Several recalled the case as unsettling due to its lack of noise or witnesses. One described it as quiet wrongness, a phrase that appeared in notes but never in official reports. That quietness, investigators concluded, had allowed the case to slip into dormancy rather than closure. The introduction of genealogical DNA searching marked a turning point. Unlike traditional database searches, this method required patience and precision. Analysts built family trees from partial matches, cross-referencing public records, obituaries, and census data. Each branch narrowed possibilities rather than nomming suspects outright. The process took months, conducted under strict legal oversight to avoid overreach. When the potential familial link emerged, it did not immediately produce an arrest. Investigators first confirmed timelines, locations, and access. They reviewed employment records showing the suspect had worked irregular hours near Old River Road during December 1992. Pay stubs indicated days off that coincided with Emily's disappearance. None of this was definitive alone, but collectively it strengthened probable cause. The decision to seek a court order for DNA collection was made cautiously. Prosecutors required a clear narrative that justified intrusion without relying on assumption. The affidavit outlined the original evidence, the genealogical findings, and the suspect's proximity to both victim and scene. A judge approved the request, noting the age of the case and the methodical approach taken. Once the DNA match confirmed involvement, investigators moved deliberately. The suspect was contacted through his local jurisdiction, avoiding public exposure until formal charges were filed. Arrest procedures followed standard protocol, without spectacle or press briefings. This restraint reflected lessons learned from past cases where premature publicity complicated proceedings. Community reaction, though muted, was deeply felt. Many residents remembered Emily as a child, then as a young woman behind the bakery counter. For older men who had lived through the early 1990s in the same town, the arrest prompted reflection on how time reshapes certainty. The streets looked the same, but understanding had shifted. Local media revisited their archives, republishing original articles alongside updates. The contrast was stark. Early reports spoke of mystery and hope for quick answers. Later coverage emphasized endurance and technological progress. Editorials avoided praise, focusing instead on the importance of preserving evidence and revisiting unresolved cases. The legal proceedings unfolded over several months. Pretrial hearings addressed admissibility of decades-old evidence. Defense motions questioned chain of custody integrity and the reliability of genealogical methods. Prosecutors responded with documentation and expert testimony. The court ruled the evidence admissible, citing careful preservation and evolving, but accepted scientific standards. Facing the weight of evidence, the suspect entered negotiations. The plea agreement acknowledged guilt without contesting specific forensic interpretations. For the Calder family, the decision spared them the strain of trial testimony and cross-examination. For the state, it ensured a conviction grounded in fact rather than performance. Sentencing recommendations balanced accountability with reality. The court considered the severity of the crime, the length of time elapsed, and the defendant's subsequent life. Ultimately, a substantial prison term was imposed, accompanied by a formal acknowledgement of responsibility. The courtroom remained quiet throughout, reflecting the tone set by all parties. After sentencing, investigators closed the file with detailed summaries, ensuring future reviewers would understand every step taken. Evidence was cataloged permanently. Digital copies were stored alongside physical artifacts. The case transitioned from active to resolved, a designation that carried administrative finality but emotional complexity. In the months that followed, the sheriff's office received letters from other families with unsolved cases, asking about cold case reviews. The Calder case became a reference point, not as a promise but as an example of persistence. Investigators responded carefully, emphasizing that resolution depended on evidence, not time alone. Emily Calder's name appeared one last time in the annual crime report, listed under solved homicides. There was no ceremony. The entry included dates, charges, and outcome. For those who remembered December 1992, the simplicity of the record contrasted with the years of uncertainty that preceded it. As another winter approached, holiday lights returned to Main Street. Snow settled along Old River Road, covering the ground evenly. The cottonwood stand remained, unmarked, part of the landscape rather than a symbol. The case had ended not with noise but with documentation, lawful process, and the quiet weight of truth established at last. The resolution of the Calder case also prompted a broader internal review within Montana law enforcement, one that extended beyond a single investigation and into institutional memory. Files from the early 1990s were revisited not only to understand what had been done, but to document why certain paths had been closed prematurely. The Calder case became a teaching reference, used quietly in training rooms to illustrate how absence of evidence can masquerade as absence of guilt. In 1992, the investigative philosophy emphasized immediacy. Cases were expected to resolve quickly or fade into statistical background. The Calder file reflected this reality. After the first 6 months, documented activity slowed, not from neglect but from saturation. Every reasonable lead had been pursued within the technological and logistical limits of the time. What remained was uncertainty, carefully filed and periodically revisited without resolution. Cold case detectives in the 2000s approached the same material with different assumptions. They treated gaps as data points rather than failures. One of the most important gaps involved Emily's social circle during the weeks before her death. Original investigators had focused on immediate family and coworkers, finding no conflicts or threats. The cold case team expanded outward, reviewing archived phone books, yearbooks, and community directories to reconstruct casual associations that might have seemed irrelevant in 1992. This effort revealed that Emily had occasionally interacted with transient workers near the river, mostly in passing. The bakery where she worked served early morning customers, including construction crews and seasonal laborers. Receipts from that period showed no anomalies, but witness recollections suggested familiarity between staff and regular patrons. This familiarity did not imply trust, but it explained how conversation could occur without suspicion. Investigators also re-examined weather data in greater detail. December 1992 had been unusually mild until Christmas Eve, when a sudden cold front moved through the valley. Roads iced over late in the evening, reducing traffic and discouraging unnecessary travel. That shift in conditions narrowed the window in which movement could occur without notice. It supported the theory that the crime occurred quickly, deliberately, and close to known locations. The suspect's movements during that period were reconstructed through employment logs, fuel receipts, and rental agreements. None of these records alone placed him at the scene, but together they undermined his original account of being home alone. Fuel purchases showed travel inconsistent with his stated location. A rental inspection report indicated he had vacated the property earlier than claimed. These inconsistencies were subtle, easily overlooked in the absence of corroborating evidence. The cold case team documented each discrepancy meticulously, aware that decades-old records required careful interpretation. They avoided narrative shortcuts, relying instead on cross-verification. This approach strengthened the eventual prosecution by ensuring that conclusions rested on cumulative fact rather than inference. The role of preserved evidence proved decisive. In 1992, technicians had collected biological material with no guarantee of future utility. Storage conditions were adequate but unremarkable. That evidence survived not because of foresight, but because of routine adherence to protocol. The cold case review highlighted this point repeatedly, emphasizing that procedural consistency can outlast technological limitation. Genealogical analysis, though central to the breakthrough, was treated as a lead generator rather than proof. Investigators resisted the temptation to frame it as a revelation. Instead, they used it to justify renewed scrutiny of existing evidence. This restraint proved critical in court, where the defense argued against over-reliance on emerging methods. As the legal process advanced, prosecutors reconstructed the timeline with care. They placed Emily's last confirmed sighting, vehicle location, estimated time of death, and scene placement into a coherent sequence. Each element was supported by documentation, witness statements, or expert analysis. The absence of dramatic confrontation underscored the case's strength. It was not built on confession or eyewitness testimony, but on convergence. Media attention increased modestly during pretrial hearings. Local reporters attended proceedings, focusing on factual updates rather than speculation. National outlets showed little interest, a reflection of the case's age and lack of sensational elements. For the community, this restraint preserved dignity and prevented distortion. The courtroom atmosphere during hearings reflected the gravity of delayed justice. Older residents recognized faces from years past, now lined and slower. Younger observers encountered the case as history rather than lived experience. The judge maintained strict decorum, limiting commentary and ensuring proceedings remained focused on evidence. The plea agreement, reached after extensive negotiation, included a detailed factual basis. This document outlined the crime without embellishment, establishing responsibility and sequence. It became part of the permanent record, accessible to researchers and future investigators. Its language was precise, avoiding emotional appeal in favor of clarity. Sentencing submissions included impact statements, though they were brief and restrained. Emily's family emphasized memory rather than loss, acknowledging the passage of time and the changes it brought. The court acknowledged their composure, noting that justice delayed still required recognition. Following sentencing, law enforcement agencies coordinated to update national databases, closing the case formally. This administrative step ensured accuracy in crime statistics and prevented duplication. It also marked the end of active inquiry, allowing resources to shift elsewhere. The Calder case influenced policy discussions at the state level. Funding for cold case units increased modestly, with emphasis on evidence preservation and interagency collaboration. Training programs incorporated lessons from the case, focusing on documentation quality and long-term viability. For the town itself, the case's resolution altered collective memory. What had once been an unresolved shadow became a closed chapter. Conversations shifted from speculation to reflection. The bakery, now under new ownership, displayed no memorial but long-time customers remembered. Seasonal rituals continued. Thanksgiving gatherings, Christmas services, and New Year's events carried subtle reminders of continuity. The town had changed, but its landscape retained familiar markers. Old River Road remained quiet, bordered by fields and trees indifferent to history. The Calder family chose privacy after sentencing. They declined interviews, issuing a short statement through the sheriff's office thanking investigators. Their restraint set the tone for community response. There were no public vigils or ceremonies, only acknowledgement. In professional circles, the case was cited as an example of patience rewarded. It demonstrated that resolution does not require spectacle, only methodical persistence. Investigators emphasized that many cold cases would remain unsolved, but each deserved the same diligence. As records were finalized, a closing summary was added to the file. It listed dates, actions, and outcomes. The final line noted compliance with all legal standards and confirmation of guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The file was sealed and archived. The passage of time did not soften the facts, but it contextualized them. The Calder case stood as a reminder that justice operates on a human scale, measured in years rather than moments. It ended not with closure alone, but with understanding grounded in evidence, process, and restraint. As the Calder case moved from courtroom resolution into institutional memory, its significance settled most deeply among those who had lived through the early 1990s in that part of Montana. For men now in their 60s and 70s, the case aligned with a period of life defined by work routines, family obligations, and trust in familiar surroundings. The idea that a young woman could disappear on Christmas Eve without immediate explanation had lingered quietly in the background of that era, resurfacing whenever winter returned. In the years immediately following 1992, the town experienced economic shifts common to rural America. Small businesses closed or changed hands, construction projects came and went, and younger residents left for opportunities elsewhere. Through those changes, Emily Calder's case remained a reference point, often unspoken but understood. It represented the limits of certainty, the knowledge that not everything yielded answers on schedule. Cold case investigators documented this social context as part of their final review. They understood that crimes do not occur in isolation, but within communities shaped by habits and expectations. In 1992, the expectation had been safety through familiarity. That assumption influenced how people assessed risk, how they reported concerns, and how quickly suspicion formed or dissolved. The Calder case challenged that assumption without overturning it entirely. As part of post-resolution analysis, investigators revisited why certain behaviors had not raised alarms at the time. Emily walking alone after work, a pickup idling briefly near an intersection, a routine route home on a holiday evening. None of these were inherently alarming in that context. The investigation concluded that no single decision by witnesses or authorities had been negligent. Rather, the crime exploited ordinary conditions. The suspect's integration into that environment was also examined. He had not stood out. His work brought him into town regularly, His vehicle was unremarkable, and his interactions were minimal but plausible. This ordinariness complicated early suspicion and reinforced the importance of evidence over intuition. Cold case reviewers noted that hindsight clarity should not be mistaken for contemporaneous oversight. The preservation of records proved to be one of the most consequential factors in eventual resolution. Handwritten notes, typed reports, and analog photographs survived multiple administrative transitions. While some materials showed wear, their continuity allowed modern investigators to reconstruct decisions accurately. This continuity reinforced the value of archival discipline, even when cases appear stagnant. Technological evolution played its role without overshadowing human judgment. DNA analysis provided the connection that investigators could not establish in 1992, but it required careful interpretation. Analysts avoided overstating certainty, presenting results within accepted statistical frameworks. This caution ensured that the scientific component complemented rather than dominated the evidentiary narrative. During sentencing, the court addressed the issue of elapsed time directly. The judge acknowledged that decades had passed, altering lives on all sides. However, the ruling emphasized that accountability did not diminish with age. The sentence imposed reflected statutory guidelines while recognizing the unique temporal context. It was neither symbolic nor excessive, but proportionate. Following the legal outcome, law enforcement agencies conducted debriefings focused on process improvement. These sessions were internal, practical, and unsentimental. Investigators discussed evidence handling, interagency communication, and the importance of revisiting assumptions. The Calder case was presented as an example of procedural endurance rather than investigative brilliance. The case also influenced how missing person reports were treated locally. While policy changes were incremental, there was renewed emphasis on early documentation and comprehensive data entry. Officers were encouraged to think in terms of future review, recognizing that today's minor detail might become tomorrow's critical link. For the community, closure arrived quietly. There were no public monuments or commemorative events. Instead, resolution manifested in conversation, often among older residents recalling where they had been in December 1992. These recollections were personal, anchored in memory rather than record. The arrest provided an endpoint to those narratives, allowing them to be told with completion. Local press coverage following sentencing reflected this tone. Articles focused on facts and timelines, avoiding dramatic language. Editorials highlighted patience and professionalism. Letters to the editor expressed relief without celebration. The consensus was subdued, shaped by respect for the victim and acknowledgement of time's passage. Emily Calder's name remained present in official records, but her story shifted from uncertainty to history. The bakery where she once worked continued operating under different ownership, its daily routines unchanged. Customers came and went, unaware of the connection unless told. The absence of visible markers underscored the town's preference for continuity over memorialization. Investigators involved in the cold case review returned to other files, carrying lessons forward. Some retired shortly after resolution, their careers ending with the satisfaction of a long-delayed answer. Others continued, applying similar methods to cases with less promise. The Calder case did not guarantee future success, but it validated persistence. From a procedural standpoint, the case reinforced the principle that cold cases require active stewardship rather than passive storage. Evidence must be revisited, assumptions challenged, and new methods applied judiciously. This approach demands resources and patience, commodities often in short supply. The Calder case demonstrated their value. As another decade approached, the case receded into formal archives. Digital records ensured accessibility, but interest naturally waned. New generations of residents learned of the case only through occasional reference. For them, it was a solved crime from the past, lacking immediacy. For others, it remained personal. The winter landscape of Montana continued its cycles. Snow covered roads, thawed, and returned. The Yellowstone River flowed past Old River Road, indifferent to human timelines. Investigators noted this constancy in their closing remarks, recognizing that place outlasts events even as memory fades. In evaluating the case's legacy, law enforcement emphasized humility. They acknowledged that success depended on cumulative effort across decades, not on any single decision. The case was solved not because of inevitability, but because evidence was preserved and revisited responsibly. The Calder case also prompted reflection on victims beyond statistics. Emily Calder was not defined by her death, but by her life within a specific community at a specific time. Investigators made a point of recording biographical details accurately, ensuring that records reflected her humanity without embellishment. As files were finalized, the case was indexed for reference in training and research. It joined other resolved cases, each with its own path to closure. Together, they formed a body of work illustrating the slow arc of justice when pursued methodically. The passage of time altered many things, but it did not alter the fundamental obligation to seek truth. The Calder case ended with confirmation rather than mystery, providing a measure of resolution grounded in law and evidence. It stood as an example of how patience, documentation, and evolving science can intersect to restore clarity after years of uncertainty. With the investigation complete and the legal process concluded, the story moved from active narration to recorded history. What remained was a quiet acknowledgement that even in the coldest seasons, answers can emerge, not dramatically, but steadily, through persistence and care. The final chapter of the Montana 1992 case did not arrive with celebration or public reckoning, but with administrative certainty and a deliberate return to order. Once sentencing concluded and appeals windows closed, the justice system shifted from action to record-keeping. Files were stamped, evidence logs finalized, and notifications issued to national databases. The machinery of law completed its work quietly, consistent with how it had operated at every stage of the case's resolution. For those who had carried the investigation through decades, the end prompted reflection rather than relief. Investigators reviewed the case one last time, not to question the outcome, but to ensure completeness. Every document, photograph, lab report, and court filing was cross-referenced. The aim was permanence. Cold cases, once resolved, must remain resolved, immune to confusion or misinterpretation by future reviewers. The Calder case closure summary emphasized procedural integrity. It documented the timeline from December 1992 through the 2022 arrest and final sentencing. Each major decision point was explained in plain language. The summary avoided emotional framing, adhering instead to verified fact. This document became the authoritative account, replacing speculation with confirmation. In professional terms, the case demonstrated how evolving standards can coexist with historical limitations. The investigation did not retroactively assign fault to early detectives. Instead, it contextualized their actions within the tools and expectations of their time. This approach mattered. It reinforced trust between generations of law enforcement, affirming that progress builds on prior effort rather than negating it. For the Calder family, the aftermath was personal and contained. They resumed private life without public comment. There were no media appearances, no memoirs, no campaigns. Their decision reflected the values common to their community, where restraint signaled strength. Closure for them meant certainty, not visibility. The town absorbed the resolution in its own understated way. Conversations acknowledged the outcome, then moved on. There was no rewriting of local identity, no defining moment imposed on civic memory. The case became part of the town's recorded past, referenced when relevant, otherwise dormant. This response reflected a collective preference for continuity. Older residents, particularly men who had lived through the early 1990s as working adults, interpreted the case through the lens of responsibility and time. Many recalled the era vividly. Long shifts, winter commutes, routines shaped by weather and daylight. Emily Calder's death had unsettled that sense of order, not through fear, but through unanswered disruption. The resolution restored balance rather than excitement. The legal outcome itself was straightforward. The sentence imposed aligned with statutory guidelines in effect at the time of conviction, accounting for the seriousness of the crime and the absence of mitigating factors sufficient to warrant leniency. There were no procedural irregularities. The judgment was final, lawful, and supported by evidence. In the years following closure, the Calder case influenced internal policy in subtle but meaningful ways. Evidence preservation protocols were reinforced. Digital archiving standards were updated. Investigators were reminded that documentation must serve not only present needs, but unknown future review. These changes did not bear Emily's name publicly, but they reflected lessons drawn from her case. Training programs incorporated anonymized elements of the investigation, focusing on patience and method. New officers learned that some cases resolve only when time and technology align. They were taught to resist assumptions and to treat unresolved files as ongoing responsibilities rather than failures. The role of forensic genealogy continued to evolve nationally, but within Montana, the Calder case served as an example of careful application rather than enthusiasm. Investigators emphasized that such methods must remain supplemental, grounded in judicial oversight and corroboration. The case demonstrated that restraint enhances credibility. As years passed, the case receded further into archives. Requests for information became rare. Researchers occasionally cited it in studies of cold case resolution timelines. Journalists referenced it in broader discussions of forensic advancement. Each reference adhered to the established facts, a testament to the clarity of the final record. Seasonal markers continued to shape memory. Each December, snow returned to Old River Road. The cottonwood stand remained unchanged, its significance known only to those who remembered. The bakery downtown opened and closed daily, its routines uninterrupted. Life continued, indifferent but stable. The Calder case underscored a fundamental truth about justice in small communities. Resolution does not erase loss, nor does it restore what was taken. It establishes truth where uncertainty once existed. That truth allows individuals and institutions to proceed without unresolved questions shaping decisions. In closing reflections, investigators noted that the case's success depended less on innovation than on continuity. Evidence was preserved. Records were maintained. Leads were revisited rather than discarded. When technology advanced, it had something to work with. This lesson informed future practice more than any single technique. Emily Calder's name remains in official records as a victim of homicide, her case marked solved. Beyond that designation, She remains part of the town's history as a young woman whose life intersected with a moment of violence that tested the limits of contemporaneous justice. The system responded slowly, but it responded correctly. The final legal outcome did not redefine the past, but it clarified it. The narrative closed without embellishment, grounded in verified sequence and lawful process. There were no unanswered questions left for investigators to pursue, no procedural loose ends. The case reached its conclusion as intended. With the file sealed and archived, the story ended not with silence but with documentation. The record stands complete, available to those who seek understanding rather than sensation. In that completeness lies the measure of resolution achieved. The Montana 1992 cold case did not teach that justice is swift. It demonstrated that justice, when pursued carefully and preserved faithfully, can endure long enough to arrive.